Hello students, this will be a short video explaining how to quote from literature in your essays using MLA formatting. We are going to use the PSM manual, so if you could please get that in front of you. You might need some post-its or highlighters or a pen so that you could take notes on the points that I'm going to point out to you. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with page 120. You'll see here on 120 that the top of the page talks about short stories or novels. So the rules for punctuation are the same whether you're writing about a short story or a novel. It says if the quotation from the short story or novel takes up 4 or fewer lines, you type it inside the paragraph. It goes in your paper in the text, and you use quotation marks. So you see the example, the narrator of Eudora Welty's, quote, Why I Live at the P.O., close quote, that's a short story, known to us only as Sister, makes many catty remarks about her enemies. For example, she calls Mr. Whitaker, and then this is a short quote from the story, quote, this photographer with the pop eyes, close quote, parentheses 46, close parentheses, period. So you see here, this quote is very short, obviously less than 4 lines. So it just goes within the paragraph. It's not separated from the paragraph at all. It flows within the sentence itself, and the page number is in parentheses afterwards. You'll notice that MLA requires the period to go on the outside of the parentheses, not before, and not within the quotations. Also, we don't have to put the name Welty in the parentheses with the number 46 because we have Eudora Welty's name within the sentence. So MLA requires the author's last name if the author's last name is not mentioned in the sentence. But since this one is, we just put the page number. So 4 or fewer lines typed in your paper, then you just put it within the paragraph. The next section, however, talks about if you have quotes that are 5 lines or more. Now, this might happen if you're writing about a major plot section in the short story and you feel the need to quote a large section of the story. Make sure that you're quoting purposefully and not just quoting to fill up space and eat up the word count, okay? That you feel that this whole section is needed to prove your point. Then, as you're typing it, if you realize that you hit 5 lines or more, you have to do something differently with that quotation. So it says you have to set the quotation off from the text by indenting it 1 inch from the left. And also do not use quotation marks. So what does that mean to indent 1 inch from the left? Basically, that means you hit the tab button twice on your computer. Normally, you hit the tab button once when you start a paragraph. To make this kind of quote, which is also called a block quote, you hit the tab button twice. So you see the example here. Sister's tale begins with I, and she makes every event revolve around herself, even her sister's marriage. Colon. Now, that's a very important punctuation mark to make note of here. It's very common to use colons when introducing quotes from literature. A comma, especially with a block quote, a comma is not enough to introduce a block quote. We need a stronger punctuation mark, which is the colon. After the colon, you hit enter on your computer, and then you hit tab. You quote the large section from your short story that you feel is necessary. No quotation marks are needed because when you do the tab, it becomes obvious to the reader that this is a quote. You use the exact punctuation marks, capitalization, everything that the author has in the original story. You copied exactly. You see at the bottom it says, and Stella Rondo broke us up, period. That's the end of the quote. And then you have the page number that it was on. You do not need to put another period at the end of the number 46. It's not required. So for short stories, it depends on the length of the quote. If it's 4 lines or less, it just goes within your paragraph. If it's 5 lines or more, you have to do a block quote. Poetry follows the same principles. For poems, it says, Enclose quotations of 3 or fewer lines of poetry in quotation marks within your text and indicate line breaks with slashes with a space on each side. So look at the example. The opening of Frost's Fire and Ice strikes a conversational tone, quote, some say the world will end in fire, space, space, some say in ice, close quote, parentheses, lines 1 through 2, period. So for poetry, if you are quoting 3 lines or less from the poem, you just put it within the paragraph. You don't separate it. You don't segregate it from the rest of the paragraph. You put quotation marks around it. And where the line breaks are in the poem, you yourself have to add slash marks to help the reader know when the lines end. Now, for poems, we don't put page numbers, we put line numbers. So that's why you see in the parentheses lines 1 through 2. Many poems exist on one page alone. So a page number is not enough to help the reader know where this quote came from inside the poem. So if it's 3 lines or less, you keep it within the paragraph. If it's 4 lines or more, we do the block. So you see this section here in the middle, it says, when you quote 4 or more lines of poetry, set the quotation off from the text by indenting 1 inch and omitting the quotation marks. That looks very similar to the block quote for the short story. Look at the example. The opening stanza of Louise Bogan's Women startles readers by presenting a negative stereotype of women, enter, tab, and then we have the 4 lines of the poem, copied exactly as they appear in the textbook. And at the end of the quote, you see the line numbers. So whether it's a poem or a short story, it's the same principle. A certain number of lines or less, you keep it inside the paragraph, use quotation marks, use parentheses to cite it, and nothing special. When you get into the longer quotes, either short story or poetry, then you have to do a block quote. Very good. Okay, there's one last page that we need to look at. This is page 129 in your PSM. Now this is moving into the MLA section of the book, and it's talking about in-text citations. And we're looking at example number 21. It says verse, play, or poem. It says, if possible, give act, scene, and line numbers. So if you're writing about a play, like Shakespeare's King Lear, you know, plays come in acts and scenes and lines. So we have to give all that information. Move down a little bit underneath the Shakespeare example, and you'll see the book is talking to you about poems. It says, for a poem, cite the part, stanza, and line numbers, if it has them, separated with periods. Now, some poems do not have any segregation, any separation at all. Mending Wall, for example, has no stanzas, no parts. It's merely lines. So for that poem, you would, in your parentheses, just put the line numbers. For other poems, Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, there are chunks in the poem. Those chunks are called stanzas. So for those types of poems, when there are obvious separations and chunks of poetry, of lines, you will have to indicate which stanza you're quoting from and the line numbers. Finally, some poems actually have parts. The poem Hurt Hawks, the author has actually designated part 1 and part 2. So you will have to designate in your citation which part you are quoting from. If you look at the example here, it says, the Green Knight claims to approach King Arthur's court, quote, because the praise of you, prince, is puffed so high, space, and your manner and your men are considered so magnificent, close quote. And then we have this long code in the parentheses. Well, the parentheses, we have three main numbers here. The first number is the part. The second number, 12, is the stanza. And the last numbers are the line numbers. So we see it's part 1, stanza 12, line numbers 258 through 259. So basically, you only have to put in what your particular poem has. If your poem does not have stanzas, you don't have to worry about it. If your poem does not have parts, you don't have to worry about it. But if your poem does, then you are held accountable for indicating which part or which stanza, and definitely which lines you're quoting from. Underneath the example, it says, for a poem that is not divided into numbered parts or stanzas, use line numbers only. For a first reference, use the word lines. So the first time you're quoting from the lines, in the parentheses, you actually write the word lines before the numbers. Thereafter, every other time that you quote from the poem, you don't have to keep writing the word lines, lines, lines. You just put the numbers. Okay, so these are the guidelines for quoting and citing poetry and short stories in MLA format using your PSM manual. Now that you know the pages and you know the important rules, your paper is expected to demonstrate these and have them in there correctly in order for you to get full credit for your MLA. If you have any questions about this, don't hesitate to contact your instructor. Thank you.